I'm going to be talking to Jason Foster, who is a professor of human resources and labor relations at the Athabasca University, about the teacher strike that's currently ongoing in Alberta. The Alberta government has hinted at back to work legislation coming next week. What are the consequences for teachers and its union? I'm going to talk to Jason about that. Welcome to the interview.
Glad to be here.
This is a contentious issue. I can't tell you how many teachers have contacted us and said, we don't have this information. What are the consequences if there's back to work legislation? Maybe just in a very general sense, you could explain that to our viewers.
Yeah, I mean, I can understand why they're looking for information. This is a fairly unprecedented time with a province-wide teacher strike, and so I can see that there's a lot of need for that. So yeah, I think essentially the Labor Relations Code has a series of penalties that it can apply, that the Labor Board has its discretion to apply in the event of an illegal strike or illegal lockout. They are mostly things aimed at the union itself. But there is the potential anyway. There is an option in the code, but also penalizing individual members.
Now, does that mean that the back to work legislation that might be introduced next week could change that? And so that there could be bigger fines, more power to target individual members of the union, the teachers themselves?
Yeah, and that's the element of uncertainty that we'll have until Monday afternoon. Is there certainly, there's the stuff we already have in the code. That's all very clear. We know what that can look like, and we can talk about that. But then the back to work legislation could introduce either increased penalties or additional penalties to what we already find in the code. That we've seen that in other jurisdictions when they've implemented back to work legislation. They often will put in stiffer penalties for that specific dispute than what their code indicates.
Well, let's talk about what back to work legislation actually means. Could you explain that, please?
Well, essentially, I like to call it's the government's get out of jail free card. It's a way that rather than actually resolve the issues of the conflict, you could just bring an end to the strike. And so it is simple as you introduce a piece of legislation that declares the strike illegal, and usually forces it then into binding arbitration, although sometimes they will actually sort of actually legislate the provisions of the contract in the legislature. So that's also a possibility. But most often these days, they just impose binding arbitration on the parties, and then the legislation will also put boundaries around what that arbitration can consider and what the arbitrator can or can't decide. And that may be where we end up have the most contention around what's in this bill, especially vis-a-vis the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in terms of what labor rights are protected under the Charter. But yeah, it's a very straightforward piece of legislation in many ways.
So, if just for the sake of our viewers who might not understand what binding arbitration means, and for my own benefit, could you define that, please?
Yeah, essentially, it's a third party who comes in to resolve a dispute, and so the arbitrator will take the best sort of proposals from each of the party. The parties will present their best proposal. They will consider the proposals, and they will make a decision about where they will land on all the various, issues that are still in dispute, and that decision is binding. The parties have no choice in it. They have no appeal mechanism. What the arbitrator says is what that new collective agreement will look like. Depending on how they set up the arbitration, the arbitrator might have to just pick between one of the two proposals, or they might be allowed to actually address each specific item, across the two proposals. And so that'll depend on what it says in the legislation. But essentially the broad process is they bring in a third party, supposedly neutral third party to resolve all of the outstanding issues, whether the parties like it or not.
How long does the arbitrator have to arrive at their decision?
That can depend, and so there'll probably be some timelines in the legislation that'll indicate how long the arbitrator will have. It's basically rule of thumb is it's a few weeks. They won't have something figured out within a week or two, but it'll be certainly less than like 6 months, and so it'll be somewhere in that lines of 4, 6, 8 weeks. So they can hear from the parties, take their time to deliberate, and then write their order. So.
And if I understand this correctly, while binding arbitration is underway, the teachers must go back to work.
Well, that's what the legislation would require. Yeah, is that this declaring their strike illegal, and so they would be required to go back to work. What I've been sort of articulating is that the teachers actually have three options once that legislation's in place. They could go back to work, and that's just the end of the strike, and life goes back to normal in our schools. That the second option is they could go back to work, but then they could do so kind of under work to rule conditions, which means they could revoke voluntary activities, right? They won't supervise the sports teams. They won't do recess supervision. They won't, those things that are not technically part of their core duties, but teachers obviously just generally do as part of their jobs. They could refuse to do those things as a way to try and exert more pressure on the government. And their third option is simply they could defy it. They could just say, nope, we're staying on strike. We're not going back in. We don't care what this law says. That is certainly an option. The airline attendants for Air Canada did that over the summer. So that, it's not unheard of.
So let's talk about what happens if the union and or its members defy the back to work order. My understanding is that there are four potential legal penalties that are allowed under the current labor code.
Yeah. So what we see under the Alberta Labor Relations Code is four types of penalties. Probably the biggest is the Labor Relations Board can issue an order to cease the payment of dues to the union. So they basically penalize the union for a period of 6 months where they wouldn't be allowed to collect union dues. So you can see that would be a fairly significant financial hit for any union. That's probably the biggest penalty that they can impose. They then can also put a fine against the union for every day that it continues to strike, for up to $1,000 a day, filed, basically applied to the union. They can also charge the leadership of the union a fine of up to no more than $10,000. That's kind of a one-time fine. And then the fourth thing, in the way they word it in the legislation is a little convoluted, but essentially it comes down to a participant in an illegal strike can be charged or can be fined up to $1,000. And so that's generally interpreted as meaning the labor board has the discretion to also fine individual members. I personally think that would be unlikely in this situation, but it's certainly in the code as a possibility.
Let's talk about possible additions to whatever back to work order, back to work legislation might be introduced on Monday. I understand there are some options like automatic loss of salary for days absent after the return to work date, deeming the strike to be a breach of contract, higher fines. Are all of those possible?
Yes. Yeah. In short, all of those things are possible. Yeah.
What else? Is there anything else in addition to those that might be possible?
We haven't seen anything else in addition to those kinds of things in recent years. I mean, there is the theoretical potential that if the courts declared the union to be, in defiance of the courts being in contempt of court, theoretically, a judge could apply a jail term to the leadership of the union. This hasn't happened since the 1960s, so I don't anticipate that to happen. But it certainly has a historical precedent. But again, I don't expect that in this scenario.
Would there be is the possibility of escalating penalties a likely outcome? The longer you stay away, the more you're fined, the more money you lose, that sort of thing.
That the legislation could totally do that. That could be one of the ways in which they enhance the penalties that we see in the code. I mean, the code has it has a daily fine, but that fine stays the same. They could do an escalator that says, if you're out 5 days, then suddenly the fine will double, right? Or whatever it might be. There's lots of ways in which they could do that. They could also just simply increase the level of the fine from $1,000 a day to $10,000 a day. Right, to sort of make that even more punitive against the union.
If contempt findings are so rare in this context, what would it take for a court to go that far in 2025?
Yeah, that's a good question. And my sense is it would probably require either that the dispute has gone on an extensively long time, or there has been some kind of aggravating incident, right? Which, because the teachers don't have picket lines, that again is unlikely. So if there was violence on the picket line, or if in some way a member of the public, was harmed in some fashion, that might foster an escalation of the penalties to that level. Again, unlikely in this particular circumstance, but certainly I think that's what it would probably require nowadays.
The Premier Danielle Smith has hinted at irreparable harm. I believe those are her words to both parents and students. Might that idea be used to as a pretext or the rationalization justification for a contempt order?
Yeah, that's certainly the rationalization they'll use. Whether the courts actually take it seriously, I think, is a whole other question. I mean, there's no evidence to her statement that there would be irreparable harm. That's just the premier musing. That doesn't actually have any weight in law. It doesn't have any weight in education research. And so they need, for public opinion for purposes, need to have a rationale, right? Oh, the kids are going to get harmed. We got to end this strike. One of the interesting things about it is that every single time a government in Canada ends a strike and orders back to work, they come up with some kind of, oh, we have to think about the public, the kids, the economy, right? They always have a reason why they bring strikes to an end. And so I think that's all the premier's really doing here, is positioning their public relations strategy. And I don't anticipate it'll have any particular legal significance.
What about Section 33, the notwithstanding clause? How might that play into this process?
I think that there is a better than 50% chance that we will find that they will use the notwithstanding clause in this legislation. And what the impact of it will be is not in the short term, it's in the longer term. It's that back to work legislation is usually challenged in the courts by the union affected. And these days it's based upon protected charter rights, right? Mostly the right to associate, but that right to associate allows free collective bargaining and the right to strike, which obviously the back to work legislation restricts both. And so they'll want to challenge that under the charter. We've certainly seen, not all, but some legislation of this nature gets overturned by the courts. Some of it gets upheld. A lot, it all depends on the specifics in the legislation and how they word it. So what using the notwithstanding clause would do is just basically take that off the table. That the union would not be able to challenge it in the courts. And so that means, therefore, there would be no potential remedies or consequences down the road. The thing about charter challenges is that they're slow. And so the unions or governments have become addicted to back to work legislation because they are effective in solving the short-term political problem by ending the strike. And if it creates more problems 6 months, a year, 2 years, 3 years down the line with a court decision saying you should never have done that, that contravenes the charter, well, you'd solved your problem already, right? And so governments, sometimes they have to they have to pay some kind of, whether it be back pay or they have to kind of do some kind of settlement in order to address the court's decision. But again, that's a future Premier of Alberta problem. That's not a current Premier of Alberta problem.
Jason, you're a scholar of labor relations, and I've interviewed Gil McGowan, the president of the Alberta Federation of Labor, and he's promising that, no, not promising. He's suggesting that the union leadership is already talking about making this province-wide if the government brings back to work legislation and uses the notwithstanding clause. And how likely is this, in your opinion? I'm asking for a bit of a crystal ball gazing here, admittedly, but how likely is it that this could really escalate and get ugly?
Well, what I look to is what happened in Ontario 2 years ago, when Doug Ford attempted to do the very same thing. In fact, he tried to preemptively end a strike of educational assistants and invoked the notwithstanding clause in that bill. It sparked huge protest, right? Thousands of people protesting multiple days in a row, huge public outcry, so much so that he had to back down 3 or 4 days later, right? And say, no, okay, I'll repeal that bill. Alberta's labor movement does not have that same level of, mobilization history. The labor movement in Alberta doesn't really have a history of doing this. This is though the kind of issue that could very well spark that. Because what it is it's no longer an issue of teachers and making teachers go back to school, back to work. It now becomes stomping on fundamental labor rights protected by the charter. And so that affects every worker, that affects everyone in the labor movement. So it certainly has the potential to spark some greater protest from the broader labor movement. Um, I'll be very interested to see how this unfolds next week.
As will we, and we'll be watching. There's a big rally today at the
Mhm.
legislature grounds in Edmonton. Tens of thousands apparently are expected, and we'll probably see interesting things happen over the weekend, leading up to whatever the government decides to do next week in the legislature. Jason, we'll be checking back with you. This has been. Thank you very much for a very clear and easy to understand explanation of a very complex issue.
My pleasure, anytime.